we talk about Janet Yellen a little bit. She's got more data to get her teeth into later today. Industrial production, retail sales, and, of course, all important, inflation numbers. OK, she'll look at that, and inflation looks very benign. Some people, when they go out, say, well, it doesn't seem like that when they're out shopping, etc. But how relevant are inflation numbers now, in your view? Because they're calculated on things which people don't necessarily buy as much of as they used to.
So the Bureau of Economic Analysis and Bureau of Labor Statistics, who put all our statistics together in the U.S., try the best they can. It's by no means perfect because, of course, as you said, people's buying behavior changes over time. It's always hard to keep that into account. And Janet Yellen talked about how just a change in the rate plans for mobile phones can have a big impact. So just one industry changing the way they charge for something can have a very large impact and a sustained impact, maybe for 6 to 9 months, on the calculation of inflation. So the Fed tries to look through that. They try to understand kind of the special circumstances. I think we do a reasonably good job. By no means perfect.
Opioids, she was asked about as well, and the effect in the employment side of things here, too. Now, I think the participation rate is probably more important to look at in a large extent. Is that why we're not getting to that non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment in the old, I suppose it'd be probably the Chicago school thinking, exactly, which you're from?
So certainly that's one of the issues. We have a much lower participation rate and a much lower employment to population ratio than we had a number of years ago.
Is that why we're not getting that wage inflation in your view?
So I think that's one of the contributing factors to it, because if you look at this broader measure of unemployment, the so-called U6 that Janet Yellen often talks about, that includes people who are part-time, would prefer to be full-time, and people who haven't looked for a job in the last month but have looked sometime in the last year and said that they'd like to work. That number is still quite elevated, although the gap between that number and the traditional unemployment rate has come down to be closer to normal levels. That suggests that we're getting closer to more normal types of wage pressures that will come. We still haven't seen them, but it's likely that we're getting closer to that.
Yeah, you know, Rish brought up some of these kind of structural changes when it comes to looking at inflation, and it is kind of a global phenomenon where you've got pretty tight labour markets elsewhere, and you can't find wage inflation, you can't find price pressure translating either. So is there a sense that it's a paradigm shift? As an economist, do you think we need to be looking at inflation and gauging inflation in a different way?
This is one of the big debates at the Jackson Hole conference that brings together central bankers from around the world just a couple of years ago. Do we need a new model, or is the more traditional so-called Phillips curve inflation unemployment trade-off still there? Unfortunately, as often with economists, we didn't come out with a definitive answer. I think some people say it's got to go back to the old relationships. Other people are saying we should have seen that by now. So I think that's why Janet Yellen and others are being very careful in not making clear commitments, saying, and inflation will go up this much because unemployment rate is so low, saying it's likely that it will, but I don't think we have the same certainty that we used to.
You know, in terms of financial risk, we've also got this once every 5 years work conference in China happening at the moment, where the key theme is reining in financial risk within the Chinese economy and financial system. From the outside, what's your view? Is it a little bit too late? Is that really a great unknown when it comes to global financial stability?
I think it's very important that they're looking at these issues, because obviously a lot of debt has accumulated in China, a lot of exotic products, these so-called wealth management products that are sort of off-balance sheet products for the banks that are a little bit like the sorts of things that we saw build up risk during the financial crisis. So I think it is important that they're focusing on it, and I think it's also important that they think about coordinating the regulation across the different bodies much more carefully than they've done before, because some of these new products have kind of slipped in between the cracks, and that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at kind of the combination of factors where you've got geopolitics quite unstable this year with North Korea, you had Janet Yellen herself saying that these fiscal policies, pro-growth, reflationary policies from Trump are looking, you know, a little bit shaky to put things in the most positive light. Volatility isn't there. So are you concerned about how calm, eerily calm things are at the moment?
I do find it puzzling, given, as you said, the geopolitical risks, the uncertainties related to North Korea, uncertainties related to the Middle East, and we don't see very much of that being reflected in market measures of risk like the VIX. Now, one of the things that's different than over the last few years is that we broadly see growth pretty much in all the key areas of the world. Brazil being an exception, the UK is finding some more challenges, but Europe, the US, much of emerging markets, China, growing reasonably steadily, and I think that makes people feel a little bit more comfortable, even if there's a shock that comes in.
Where do we go next, Andy? That's the thing. We really struggle to get ourselves to some sort of level of normalcy here where, you know, these central banks are in a position to perhaps unwinding the QE they have in place. But we're still not quite there for some reason.
Well, I think it gets back to what we were just talking about with respect to inflation, because in traditional models and in traditional circumstances, we would have seen a lot more inflation pressure than we have so far. And so I think that's one of the reasons why the central banks are wary of going too far too fast, because we actually saw this with the ECB. They allowed their balance sheet to decline by €1 trillion, and that led to a potential deflation. And now they've had to act very strongly to try to move against that. None of the central banks want to make that mistake.
If you were Mario Draghi, what would you be doing now?
So I think Mario is right to start to talk about the potential for slowing down the pace of asset purchases, actually much like Ben Bernanke did in 2013, and much like Ben Bernanke's had a little bit of difficulty in sort of conveying his message clearly. Maybe at Jackson Hole he'll be able to clarify that, but I do think he has to set the foundation for it, because in Europe you're starting to see inflation move towards its 2% goal, and you're seeing pretty strong economic growth, particularly given the demographic situation where you're not
especially
seeing a lot
Northern
of
Europe,
yeah, you're seeing very strong growth, and so this is the time to start thinking about a bit of an unwind.